1992 saw the release of The Empire Strikes Back for the Nintendo Entertainment System, not only an adaptation of the second Star Wars feature film, but also a spiritual sequel of sorts to the first Star Wars game on the NES. I say spiritual sequel because despite being conceived by JVC and Lucasfilm Games, Empire bears very few similarities with its predecessor in terms of gameplay, graphical style, and general overall quality. The general gist of Empire is as follows. You assume the role of Luke Skywalker and must endure several trials in your quest to become a Jedi Knight and eventually confront the Dark Lord himself, Darth Vader. This means fighting through Wampa beasts and probe droids in the Hoth caverns, tackle walkers in your snowspeeder, train under Jedi Master Yoda in Dagobah, and eventually save your friends in Cloud City. For the most part, the narrative does a fairly good job of adapting the film's plot, although it sort of skews towards the end. In particular, having to fight Boba Fett and his Slave One assault craft in your X-Wing, no doubt a deleted scene from one of the 50 special editions on the market. In contrast to the first Star Wars game on NES, Empire only gives you one playable character in Luke Skywalker, and the game in general adopts a more linear progression. You start off with a regular blaster that can be shot in any of the 8 directions, but you'll eventually come across a lightsaber sooner or later, and you'll be able to swap between the two weapons by pressing select. Controlling Skywalker is finicky and awkward, especially in regards to platforming. Skywalker's jumps aren't very high and cover little distance, and if you're going for a long drop, you're essentially immobile until you eventually land on solid ground. You could charge your jumps by holding down until Luke flashes, but this isn't always ideal in tense situations. Aiming your blaster isn't all that great either. You could shoot downwards by pressing down and B, but unfortunately, you'll still be shooting downwards when standing until you press another direction. This is admittedly useful for raining death from above, but not so much when you're trying to avoid enemy fire and you want to shoot straight ahead. Fortunately, all is not lost, for in addition to health pickups that are scattered throughout the level or sometimes dropped by enemies slain, you'll encounter force powers that can be used to give yourself an edge. Some of these powers are useful, such as force jumping, levitation, and enhanced attack power for your weapons, while others are less so, like this ear thing that drains force power and seemingly serves no logical purpose. Even the instruction manual makes no mention of this particular power. On occasion, you'll play vehicle levels, such as the Battle of Hoth, where you guide your snowspeeder and pit it against a group of Imperial walkers in an effort to defend a rebel base. In a sense, this particular level reminds me of the Atari 2600 video game based on this particular sequence, and this could be seen as something of a spiritual successor or remake. The only difference here is that you have a limited number of harpoons to make life somewhat easier. Well, that, and also, when your snowspeeder is shot down, you could still continue onwards on foot and take down the walkers from the underbelly until you eventually find another snowspeeder floating about. The later X-Wing levels are more or less the same thing, except you're shooting down cloud cars, TIE fighters, and eventually Slave One, which, again, I must have missed that scene in the movie when I saw it like 50 times in all its various incarnations. Empire's levels are massive labyrinths that are easy to get lost in. If nothing else, a good chunk of the game's difficulty in the standard platforming segments is trying to figure out where in the blue hell you're supposed to go. This does encourage something of an open-ended mentality where you can explore every nook and cranny in the level in hopes of finding force abilities or extra continues or the like, but because some levels have a tendency of looking alike, there's an early confusion as to whether you're really exploring a new part of the level or just unintentionally backtracking to some part you've already been. The other major issue with Empire is that when push comes to shove, Skywalker is simply ill-equipped to deal with the onslaught of enemies that await him because his power levels are fairly weak. It takes about 100 hits to kill this one spider. It takes about 100 hits to kill this one Wampa. And while it's taking you forever to take down this one walker, in one of the few instances where it would make sense to take forever, it takes a quick barrage of weapons fire to do you in a short amount of time, since you have no invincibility frames for reprieve or any sort of breathing room. To say nothing of the knockback that each hit causes that might potentially lead you to a life-threatening hazard. Your only means of upgrading your offensive capabilities is through the appropriate force powers, which only last about as long as you have force energy, and force energy is required for all those other force abilities that might help you in a pinch, and force energy does not always come in abundance. So when you need to levitate towards the top of a particular level and you've already exhausted all your force power with lightsaber enhancements, yeah, good luck with that. All of this factors to what essentially becomes an overwhelmingly frustrating experience, and a challenge level that seems astronomical, not because it's a genuinely tough game that pushes your skills to the limit and feels rewarding when conquered, but because your player is more often than not ill-equipped to properly handle the challenge ahead, and when you somehow conquer said challenge, there's no gratification or sense of reward that comes with the accomplishment. You're just glad the bloody thing's over and done with, so you never have to play the damn thing again. Say what you will about Star Wars on NES, but that game gave you everything you needed from the get-go to conquer the challenge that the game threw at you, even if you chose not to go after the extra characters and items that would help your odds a bit. And, well, jumping ahead here, even the Super Star Wars games, as challenging and borderline insane as the difficulty of those games were, you were given all the tools and skills needed to conquer the challenge ahead, and you never truly felt out of your element. Empire doesn't have the courtesy to give you even that much, as it's content to saddle you with a protagonist that not only lacks the platforming skills to properly navigate simple level elements, but also lacks the tactical capabilities to fend off enemy forces in a functional manner. And if you die, you start the whole level all over again for as long as you have continues, and once those run out, well, you know. For all intents and purposes, Empire's visuals are something of a mixed bag. It's clear they were trying to go for a slightly more realistic style graphically, as there is quite a bit of detail in regards to the various level set pieces and the cutscenes. The level design suffers somewhat from monotony, and that gives the game a sense of deja vu at times. The character animation seems a bit more fluid when it comes to the human-sized characters, and even the slightly larger foes are somewhat decently animated and detailed. It's just too bad that some of the sprite work itself is somewhat less than impressive from a purely visual standpoint. Skywalker looks plain and dull, and the constant color changes throughout the game doesn't help matters, while some of the larger, more recognizable elements such as Imperial Walkers, Snowspeeders, probe droids, and the like resemble what they're supposed to and look really good given all the detail work. The humanoid characters are less so in a somewhat inconsistent fashion. Some are lean and lacking, others are chunky and messy, but hey, at least Darth Vader looks somewhat intimidating with his black armor, his blue lightsaber, and his laser pistol. What? There is little to say in regards to sound because there's very little of the sound. Most of the game's soundtrack comprised background noises and delayed sound effects with the occasional jingle that plays every so often and when a boss encounter is taking place. The jingles themselves are fairly brief and sound a bit low quality, but they're familiar tunes from the classic score. The only noteworthy bit here are the occasional bits of digitized sound, whether it be in brief voice bites or animal sounds. If anything, the additional digitized sound, as grainy as they may be, makes this particular cutscene a worthwhile moment in the game.
The Force is with you, young Skywalker.
Overall, Empire Strikes Back on the NES is a deeply flawed and otherwise underwhelming adaptation of perhaps one of the most highly regarded films in the Star Wars saga. There are instances where the game really shines and provide players with the potential for what could have been a great Star Wars game on the NES, but unfortunately all those instances took place in the Battle of Hoth. When it comes to the main gameplay aspects, the platforming, Empire falters with its less than stellar controls, its disturbingly underpowered protagonist, and an overwhelming difficulty level that requires more than what the game is willing to offer the player in terms of tools and skills. There's a part of me that wanted to like this game, wanted to overlook the flaws and salvage some semblance of enjoyment out of this one, but unfortunately, the only thing I got out of Empire on NES was Wampa dumplings frozen in carbonite. A pity.